Hi class, let's get started with our discussion on human evolution. So, diving in. First, we need to talk about origins of life. And generally speaking, when most people talk about evolution, they are not referring to chemical evolution, or they're not referring to how life began. Generally speaking, in the public, or there's at large, when we talk about the theory of evolution, we're talking about how living organisms influence each other to create new or different living organisms. This first bit that we're going to talk about is called chemical evolution, talks about hypotheses for how life initially began, and this is known as chemical evolution. When we look at chemical evolution, we try to hypothesize or come up with ways for the first cell to come in existence. If we look at the early atmosphere of the Earth, there's evidence that the early atmosphere of the Earth had the conditions necessary to form simple organic molecules. And those molecules, the simple organic molecules, would spontaneously combine to form macromolecules. And it's hypothesized that instead of having DNA in the first cells, instead the first cells were powered by RNA, ribonucleic acids. And the reason for this is that we can still transmit genetic information as RNA, and RNA can act as an enzyme, specifically the ribozyme. Now, if you look at these early cells, these protocells, it's hypothesized that the proteins and lipids made in them could metabolize simple molecules. There still could be simple chemical reactions taking place. However, it was also believed that these protocells could not reproduce. I need to emphasize that, could not reproduce. Now, a true cell can reproduce and have DNA as its genetic material. These protocells didn't have DNA and couldn't reproduce, so they still weren't technically considered alive. So if we look at this early on, in the early Earth, there were simple organic molecules made. These simple organic molecules made larger organic molecules that then combined to form long polymers. And then phospholipids would spontaneously combine to form membranes. And this has actually been shown in a lab setting, where phospholipids mixed in a jar of water will spontaneously form micelles without any intervention at all. And then these early protocells that still didn't have DNA could have simple metabolism but couldn't reproduce yet. And it wasn't until DNA was added and reproduction was enabled that we had actual cells. Now, this chemical evolution down here, this is poorly understood. Bits and pieces of it have been replicated in a lab setting, but I need to emphasize that we've never gone from inorganic chemicals to a living cell within a lab setting. If someone was able to pull it off, I guarantee you they would get a Nobel Prize for it. So, guys and gals, concept check. The idea of chemical evolution applies to living organisms directly. True or false? Go ahead and pause this video and get me an answer right now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, the answer is false. Chemical evolution does not apply to living organisms directly. If we go back a slide here, chemical evolution talks about the origins of life, how the first cell came into existence. When we think of life changing or living organisms directly, generally speaking, what we think of is biologic evolution. So, let's talk about biologic evolution. With biological evolution, we are going to have changes in populations or species over time, and this results in new species, novel adaptations, new organisms being produced. There are two very key or important points that need to be emphasized for biological evolution. One is that we need to have a common ancestor, and the common ancestor will result in us having common chemistry. This means that, generally speaking, for most organisms, DNA is going to be used to code for the machinery, the blueprint of life. And then secondly, living things are going to change or adapt to their environment. And I don't necessarily mean that we are going to grow fur or take off a jacket or go inside when we get cold. When we talk about living things adapting to their environment, we're talking about a generational adaptation. From generation to generation, the species adapts to its environment. When we say adaptation, we're referring to adding or subtracting characteristics that will allow that species, that population, to better survive and reproduce in its given environment. For example, if we took an Arctic fox and replaced its white hair with black hair, that Arctic fox would be much more noticeable, and it would be much less likely to reproduce because it would have a much harder time sneaking up on prey to hunt because it would stick out like a sore thumb, being a black fox in a bunch of snow. Natural selection is the driving force of chemical evolution. Natural selection has been widely supported in laboratory experiments in that natural selection has been able to eliminate undesirable traits from sample populations. Natural selection was initially proposed by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin gets most of the credit for it, even though there were a contemporary of his time that was competing with him to get this theory proposed. Natural selection says that species become adapted to their environment, and the better adapted species outproduce and outcompete the less adapted species, or organisms within a species. When we look at natural selection, first we need to have variation. There needs to be differences within a population. And these differences need to be able to be passed from generation to generation. Some of these differences are good and helpful, other differences are bad. And these organisms are always going to be competing with themselves within the population. So there needs to be some kind of a competition. And as this competition is taking place, the organisms that have the better variations, the better adaptations, live longer and reproduce more, and then have more offspring with that adaptation or variation. And then generation after generation, that favorable variation or that beneficial variation becomes more and more common until it becomes the norm for the population. It becomes a permanent adaptation. So, first let's talk about Lamarck. Lamarckian evolution. Lamarckian evolution thought that physical effort, or in other words, thought that personal decisions made by an organism would influence the physical characteristics of that organism's offspring. And to some degree, this is true. If you want to read more about this, you should read up on epigenetics. And now I remember why I dislike this smartboard so much. The calibration is so far off. Sorry about that, guys. So Lamarck hypothesized that originally all giraffes had super duper short necks. And those giraffes would stretch up to the trees to reach higher and higher and higher. And as the trees got higher, the giraffes reached higher. From generation to generation, the giraffe's neck got longer. Darwin proposed that there was variation in giraffe populations. Some giraffes had long necks, some had short necks. The giraffes with the short necks couldn't reach the food in the trees, and they died off. And then only giraffes with long necks survived, and then the population as a whole, their species as a whole, developed longer and longer necks. Now, as we look at our theory of biological evolution, there are multiple lines of evidence that support this theory. We can look at the fossil record. We can look at biogeographical evidence, which is a nice way of saying that we can look at how life changes from continent to continent. We can look at anatomical evidence, homologous structures, and then we can look at biochemical evidence, particularly the genetic code. So first, let's talk about the fossil record. A fossil is some kind of permanent record or some kind of evidence of past life. Fossils allow for us to trace descent or how organisms have changed throughout time. And if we look at the fossils that Charles Darwin had access to, there were not that many. Since Charles Darwin initially proposed his hypothesis, gaps within the fossil record have been filled in, and as time has gone on, more and more fossils have been discovered to fill in the gaps within the fossil record. A gap in the fossil record, generally speaking, needs to be filled in by a transitional species with a transitional fossil. A transitional fossil represents characteristics of two different groups of organisms. I remember back in 2006 when this fossil was initially discovered and announced. It was all over the science news. It's the Tikalik fossil, or Tikalik rose, for its scientific name. And this was a fossil of a fish that exhibited characteristics of both an amphibian and of a fish. What do we mean? We mean that this organism had ribs that expanded outward, much like an amphibian did. It had a neck like an amphibian did, and it had eyes on top, an eye structure very similar to what an amphibian did. But this organism also had fins, and it also had scales like a fish. This organism exhibited traits of both amphibians and of fish. We should also emphasize, as we look at this fossil, that, and your textbook didn't necessarily emphasize this, but this fossil has a very different structure for the fins. This fossil represents more of a limb with a fin at the end than a traditional fish fin. And as we look at this fossil record, it tells us that life has gone, generally speaking, from simple to more complex. The elephant in the room that we need to acknowledge is the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is kind of the redheaded stepchild in this fossil record, in that many, many different genuses and genera and domains of species appeared out of nowhere, relatively speaking, within the fossil record. But after that Cambrian explosion, we can trace many origins and many descents and many lineages of our species. The first organisms that appear within our fossil record are single-celled organisms, prokaryotic organisms. And these prokaryotes are then followed very shortly in geologic time, in millions of years, by eukaryotic organisms, and then multicellular eukaryotes. These are typically going to be soft tissue fossils that are found in the from the Precambrian era. And then, once the Cambrian era has been reached, we have many bony fossils being discovered. We have fish being discovered. We have plants. We have flowering, non-flowering plants. We have, within our fossil record, a general timeline, a relative timeline, in that we had aquatic life before terrestrial life. We had non-flowering plants before flowering plants, so we had gymnosperms before angiosperms, amphibians before reptiles, and based off of multiple lines of evidence, we now believe that dinosaurs are directly linked to birds. In the 2000s, some very interesting research was published regarding Tyrannosaurus rex fossils, where a young PhD student was able to isolate soft tissue, reconstitute soft tissue from the bone marrow of a T-Rex fossil. And she was also able to reconstitute red blood cells from a Tyrannosaurus rex. Right now, the race is on to reconstitute DNA fragments from those fossils. A classic transitional species is Archaeopteryx. This is believed to be the first bird. It had a tail that had vertebrae. It also exhibited claw-like structures similar to many of the dinosaurs, and it had feathers. And this was a unique fossil in that you could see the feathers within the fossil itself. Other classic transitional species within the fossil record include the Ambicuceus to the Basilosaurus to the right whale transition, or stage of progression. Other common lineages include the horse lineage that had Eohippus in it. Your textbook doesn't go into that lineage, though. Now, if we look at the second line of evidence, biogeography. Biogeography looks at how we have life spread across the planet. What's life or organisms spread across the continents. The theory, or this evidence from biogeography, supports the theory of evolution because it shows that organisms started in one location and then spread outward from that one location. However, organisms were not able to spread if some geographic feature were separating them. So if we look at an island that's isolated, that can't have a lot of spreading or exchange of species or exchange of genetic information, we find that island life, generally speaking, has very unique life forms associated with it compared to the mainland continents, which are connected to each other. Classic examples include Madagascar and Hawaii, particularly Madagascar. If we look at the continent of Australia, the continent of Australia has many mammals on it. Those mammals on Australia, though, are generally speaking are going to be marsupial mammals, not placental-based mammals. And if we looked at other continents that are connected to each other, or were connected to each other more recently, instead of having lots of marsupial-based mammals, they have placental-based equivalents on the North and South American continents, or Asian African continents. Another piece of evidence that supports biologic evolution is that there are homologous structures or analogous structures, so to speak, between different species. For example, if we looked at the forelimb or the legs of vertebrates, there are going to be similar structures from limb to limb. Now, an analogous structure is a structure that serves the same function as between species, but they don't necessarily have common ancestry. So if we look at homologous structures have common ancestry and serve the same function. Analogous structures serve the same function but don't necessarily share that common function. And then we have vestigial structures. These are structures that are fully developed in one group and that are reduced or potentially have no function in the other group. And I'll personally admit, this is the category I have the most difficulty with, because when we think of a structure, just because we don't know the use of that structure right now doesn't necessarily mean that it does not have a use. For example, many older textbooks will talk about the human appendix as a vestigial structure. The human appendix is not a vestigial structure. It serves a function. It has lots of secondary lymphatic tissue in it, and that was only recently discovered. Another common vestigial structure that's cited, which really is not a vestigial structure, is the human tailbone. The human tailbone has a very important function. The coccyx of the human serves as an anchoring site for the anal sphincters that aid with defecation. Individuals that break their tailbone, generally speaking, have a difficult time pinching it off, so to speak. So let's look at some homologous structures. Here we can see a human arm, and this human arm is going to have a humerus in pink, and then we'll have a radius in purple, an ulna in blue, carpals in green, and then metacarpals and phalanges in orange. And from organism to organism, we find that these structures can remain very similar, very close to each other. We can even find homologous structures within vertebrate embryos. This field of embryology was initially proposed by Haeckel. There was a little bit of controversy regarding Haeckel in that it was later found that he forged some of his embryologic drawings. But thankfully now we have lovely photographs that are much more accurate than his drawings. And it's found that even within different species, there are different structures within utero, whereas those organisms are embryos. And then finally, we have category number 4. That's the biochemical evidence. This biochemical evidence primarily focuses on the genetic information of that organism. So most organisms are going to use DNA to convey its genetic code, and will use ATP as the cellular form of energy. And the same genetic code, the same triplet code is used in all of these organisms. And these organisms use the same amino acids within their proteins. We've found that living things are going to have the same genes. Most of the genes in a frog are going to be the same as the genes in a human being. And the more similar the species, the more similar the genes are between the species. So if we were to look at human and we were to look at specific proteins within the organisms, even specific proteins within the organisms can be the same. Cytochrome C is a protein that aids us with making cellular energy. Within the mitochondria of eukaryotic cells, cytochrome C is used to help carry high energy electrons from one location to another location and to build up a proton gradient used to power the generation of ATP. If we compare a human to a human, there, generally speaking, are zero differences in cytochrome C peptide sequences. And the reason we do comparisons of cytochrome C to cytochrome C between species, or another common comparison is the small ribosomal subunit between species, is we want to compare structures or proteins that are very important to life. These structures or proteins that are very important to life, generally speaking, are going to have a very slow rate of change or a very slow rate of mutation, so we can find more similarities between the organisms and draw more meaningful differences. So if we look at a human to human, there's no differences. Humans to chimps have 2 mutations, and then pigs, which are fairly similar to humans from a physiological perspective, have about 9 mutations between their cytochrome C sequences. And as we go to increasingly different species, we're going to have more and more mutations. So we're still working with vertebrates. The fish have 20 mutations. Once we jump down to invertebrates, we'll have 30 mutations. And then if we look at a yeast, single cellular organisms, that cytochrome C is going to have quite a few mutations compared to the human being. So, class, concept checked. Does natural selection increase the diversity of life? Yes or no? Or excuse me, natural selection directly increases the life, true or false? So go ahead and pause this video right now and get me an answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Alrighty, the correct answer is false. Natural selection does not increase the diversity of life directly. Natural selection specifically is going to eliminate diversity. More precisely, natural selection is going to result in unfavorable traits being eliminated. Natural selection does not introduce the new traits. Natural selection specifically edits out unfavorable traits. So if we look at natural selection by itself is not a creative force. Natural selection is what allows for the more favorable traits to increase in frequency within a population. And that's all we have for this video recording class. If you have any questions for me about this lecture material, please feel free to post it on the class discussion board, shoot me an email, or swing by my office when you're on campus. Happy studies!